The night a Lakota war captain stood in the dust of a lonely homestead and told a quiet rancher, "I need you to raise my child." The West itself seemed to stop breathing. The first time Jonah saw the Lakota warrior, he was carrying a sack of feed through the failing light, the sun bleeding red across the plains, as if warning him that nothing good rides in on silence. Yet silence was all that followed the tall rider who approached on a black horse with feathers tied in its mane, and war paint streaked across the man's sharp cheekbones. Jonah, a soft-spoken rancher who spent his days tending half-dead cattle and patching fences that never seemed to hold, wasn't used to visitors, especially not ones with braided hair, cold black eyes, and a presence that made the world shrink around them. The warrior introduced himself as Chaitin, his voice low and steady, telling Jonah he knew him as the man who patched fences instead of pointing rifles, who watched Lakota riders pass but never lifted a weapon, who once left medicine by a creek for a half-frozen scout instead of trapping him for bounty. And Jonah tried to laugh it off as a coincidence, but Chaitin wasn't a man who mistook kindness for accident. When Jonah asked what he wanted, Chaitin stepped closer with the weight of thunder in his shadow and said the words that bent the air, "I need a child from you," sending Jonah's thoughts spinning into fear, misunderstanding, and the memory of every cruel whisper the town spoke about him being too gentle, too quiet, too strange. Before Jonah could stumble through the panic, Chaitin clarified it wasn't Jonah's body he wanted. It was Jonah's protection. And from the brush stepped a small boy with dark hair, wide, uncertain eyes, and a leather-wrapped bundle clutched to his chest like it held the last piece of his world. His name was Nikan, barely 4 years old, and Chaitin explained that soldiers had raided their winter camp, killing Nikan's mother, Chaitin's sister, and scattering those too young or wounded to flee. Now the tribe had to move quickly through dangerous land, hunted by blue coats who shot the slow and captured the weak, and Nikan could not survive the journey. Jonah tried to protest that he was alone, that he barely fed himself, that the town hated anything that didn't look like them, but Chaitin told him he had watched Jonah for months, watched him mend instead of harm, watched him move through life like someone who understood loneliness the way some men understand war. When Jonah asked what he should tell the boy someday, Chaitin said to tell him his uncle loved him enough to give him a life away from hatred, that he trusted a gentle man more than a strong one because gentle men rebuild what the world breaks. Nikan looked at Jonah with a mix of fear and hope, clutching his tiny bundle of his mother's belongings. And Jonah, feeling something shift deep inside him, like dry earth stirring at the promise of rain, knelt and offered him the only thing he had, a home, however cracked and quiet. When Nikan reached out and placed his small hand in Jonah's trembling one, the world changed not with thunder, but with a soft, irreversible weight. And as Chaitin rode away into the blood-colored dusk, Jonah stood with the child pressed against his side, knowing the town would curse him, the soldiers might hunt him, and life would never again be simple, but also knowing, maybe for the first time, that some choices grow roots deeper than fear. The first weeks with Nikan settled over Jonah's ranch like a ghost. The land didn't know how to carry, and though the boy rarely spoke more than a few words, his presence reshaped every inch of the quiet homestead, filling the empty spaces Jonah had long accepted as part of himself, yet now found strangely heavy with responsibility and unspoken fear. Each morning, Jonah woke before dawn to the sound of Nikan's small feet padding across the floor as he checked every window and corner, as if bracing for the return of soldiers or monsters he couldn't name. And Jonah, unsure how to offer comfort beyond presence, would light the stove and coax the boy into morning with simple food, patience, and the soft tone he used on spooked horses. Jonah had always lived in silence, but Nikon's silence was different. Sharp, watchful, carrying memories too heavy for a child. And some nights Jonah woke to the sound of muffled crying. The boy curled into himself beneath his blanket, clutching the leather-wrapped bundle of his mother's things as if holding on to her shadow. Jonah never forced him to stop crying, never touched him without permission, only sat close enough for the boy to feel he wasn't alone, whispering that he was safe now, even though Jonah himself didn't fully believe it, because the town's stairs grew colder with each visit, and rumors spread faster than prairie fire. When Jonah rode into town for supplies with Nikon sitting in front of him on the saddle, every head turned. Conversations fell to bitter hushes, and the sheriff's narrow eyes tracked them with suspicion, so sharp Jonah felt it like a blade against his spine. Children pointed, mothers pulled them close, and the storekeeper's wife refused to hand Jonah his change without wiping the counter afterward, muttering that savages bring savagery, while Jonah bit his tongue until he tasted blood, refusing to let anger spill into violence because he knew one wrong move would damn both him and the child who now depended on him. Nikon sensed the hatred, even if he didn't understand it, pressing against Jonah's chest with small, trembling fingers, and Jonah would whisper, "You're all right, little one," even as his own chest tightened with dread, because he knew hatred had a way of growing teeth in places like this. At night, Jonah often stood on the porch, long, after Nikon slept, staring across the plains toward where Chaitan had vanished weeks before, wondering whether he was alive or lying somewhere in the dirt with his blood soaking into a land that never cared who it killed. He found himself listening for distant hoofbeats, half hoping the Lakota warrior would return with news, and half fearing that if he did, he would bring danger trailing behind him. One evening, a dust storm rolled across the plains like a living thing, wind howling, dirt choking the air in thick clouds, and Jonah had to drag Nikon inside as the boy screamed Chaitan's name into the rising storm, convinced his uncle was somewhere out there lost and calling for him. Jonah held the frightened child against his chest until the wind finally died, the house shaking beneath the storm's rage, and in that moment he understood that Nikon didn't fear the wind. He feared being abandoned again. In the days that followed, Jonah began teaching Nikon small chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, brushing the old mare, simple tasks meant to tether the boy to a rhythm of normal life, and slowly Nikon began to open, pointing at things and naming them in Lakota, laughing in small bursts whenever Jonah mispronounced a word so badly even the horses looked offended. Those tiny moments of light stabbed Jonah with unexpected warmth, yet also guilt, because each giggle reminded him of the boy's stolen mother and the uncle still fighting for a tribe hunted like animals. But shadows crept back quickly when strangers began circling the ranch. Rough-looking drifters, young men with whiskey on their breath and hate in their eyes, stopping on the road to watch Jonah's house as if waiting for a sign or an excuse to act, muttering things like, "Man's harboring an enemy's blood," and "Army's looking for Lakota stragglers. Maybe we ought to help 'em." Jonah kept the rifle loaded, though he hated the weight of it, hated what pointing it meant. But every night he placed it beside the door within easy reach, because Nikon's safety mattered more than his own peace. One night, Jonah woke to Nikon shaking him, eyes wide with terror, whispering, "Horses!" And outside the window, moonlight glinted off silhouettes moving toward the barn. 3 men, armed, their voices low and mean, talking about getting a look at the redskin kid, and teaching the rancher a lesson about picking the wrong side of this land. Jonah's blood went cold, and he grabbed Nikon, hiding him beneath the floorboards through a loose panel he'd prepared days earlier for emergencies, whispering, "Don't make a sound, no matter what happens," before stepping outside with the rifle cocked but pointed low, because he knew a single wrong twitch could turn the night into a grave. The men taunted him, calling him a coward, a traitor, a fool, and Jonah tried to stay calm, voice steady as he told them to leave his land. But they advanced, claiming they had the right to check for Indian spies, and one reached for the barn door as if the ranch belonged to him. Jonah fired a warning shot into the dirt, the boom splitting the night, and the men froze, but only for a second, because the leader snarled and raised his gun. Before Jonah could even aim for a second shot, a fourth rider emerged from the darkness with the silent force of a storm rolling over the plains. An arrow whistled from the shadows and thudded into the ground at the intruder's feet, sending all three scrambling backward in pale shock. A voice Jonah recognized cut through the cold night air like steel scraping stone. Chayton, alive, breathing hard, grime on his face and fury in his eyes. "Leave," he growled in perfect English, "before the next one finds your heart." The men didn't wait to see if he meant it. They ran, stumbling toward their horses, cursing Jonah and the damn savages, but too afraid to turn back. As their hoofbeats faded into the darkness, Jonah lowered the rifle with shaking hands while Chayton dismounted, looking thinner, harder, older than when he had left, as if each mile had carved a new line into his face. "You came back," Jonah whispered, breath catching. Chayton nodded once, eyes searching the ranch as if expecting danger to return at any moment. "My people are scattered," he said. "The soldiers are hunting any who survived. I came to see if the boy still breathes." Jonah moved the floorboard, and Nikon bolted out, crying, "Uncle!" as he wrapped himself around Chayton like a child gripping the last solid thing in a breaking world. Chayton held him tightly, breath shuddering, and Jonah realized with a twist of his gut that this reunion wasn't just relief. There was something terrible behind Chayton's eyes, something he hadn't said yet. And Jonah, staring at the warrior's trembling hands and the dust-stained pain etched into his features, understood with chilling clarity that whatever storm had chased Chayton here wasn't finished, and it was coming straight for all of them. The moment Chayton stepped into Jonah's small house with Nikon clinging to his waist, Jonah could feel the weight of something dark following the warrior like an unseen shadow, something too heavy to be carried only by a single man. And though Chayton said nothing at first, Jonah could see the truth in the tremor of his hands, the way his breath dragged as if pulled through a wound rather than lungs, and the ghostly emptiness in his eyes that only men who have watched their world burn ever carried. Jonah closed the door quietly, sliding the bolt in place, aware that the air outside felt wrong. Charged, brittle, like a prairie field moments before lightning strikes. And when he finally asked, in a low, steady voice, "What happened to your people?" Chayton did not answer immediately. He stared at Nikon, touching the boy's hair as if reassuring himself he was real. And then, in a voice scraped raw, he said the soldiers had caught up with the remnants of his band 2 days north, attacking before dawn with rifles and torches, claiming they were there to enforce relocation. A lie wrapped in blood, because men who bring peace do not burn children's bedding or tie warriors to stakes to make examples of them. Chayton had escaped with 3 others, only to watch one die from wounds too deep to heal, another collapse from hunger, and the last vanish into the night, saying he could no longer run. Now, the Lakota band that had once filled the winter camp with firelight and laughter was nothing more than scattered ghosts running from bullets on land that had always been theirs. Jonah listened with his jaw clenched, hands fisting at his sides, because the man who had trusted him with a child now had nowhere left to return to. No tribe strong enough to protect even its healthy warriors, let alone a boy small enough to be crushed by the boot of any passing soldier. Jonah offered food and water, and Chaitan accepted only when Nikon tugged on his hand, urging him to eat, because even warriors bend when a child's worry softens the blow of pride. But as the lamplight flickered over Chaitan's face, Jonah noticed something else. Blood drying along his ribs beneath the leather shirt, dark stains glistening where an arrow or blade had torn through flesh. Jonah's chest tightened, and without a word, he grabbed clean cloths and warm water, motioning for Chaitan to sit. The warrior shook his head at first, insisting it was nothing. But Jonah glared at him with a quiet defiance, the same quietness that had convinced Chaitan to trust him in the first place. And finally, Chaitan allowed him to lift the shirt, revealing a long gash across his side that had turned the angry color of infection. Jonah cleaned it slowly, carefully, aware of Nikon watching with wide, terrified eyes, whispering small Lakota prayers under his breath, and Chaitan clenched his teeth in silence, refusing to show pain until, finally, he exhaled a ragged breath and whispered, "They will come here next." The words hit Jonah harder than any bullet. He froze, bandage halfway wrapped, and Chaitan explained that the soldiers who attacked his people were hunting survivors, tracking footprints, following trails of blood and smoke. And they believed Nikon was among the missing children, because an officer had held up a leather-wrapped bundle taken from the ashes of the camp and asked, "Whose is this?" before ordering it destroyed. Jonah felt something inside him snap, a cold fire blooming in a place he didn't know existed, because taking a child's keepsake was not war. It was cruelty for the sake of cruelty. And if those same men learned Nikon was alive on Jonah's ranch, they would come not to negotiate, but to finish what they started. Jonah argued they could go to the sheriff, but Chaitan shook his head with a bitter smile, explaining that some sheriffs saw native people as animals to be counted, traded, or erased. And Jonah could not deny the truth. He had seen the sheriff's eyes on Nikon, seen the thinly veiled contempt, the quiet threat lurking beneath the lawman's polite words. The house felt smaller suddenly, the shadows longer, as if danger had already slipped through the cracks beneath the door. Jonah asked where the soldiers were now, and Chaitan said they had passed through a settlement half a day west of the ranch, asking questions, flashing wanted posters with sketches of warriors and children, offering rewards for information or bodies. Worse, the ranch hands Jonah had scared off earlier had likely run straight to town, telling lies about Jonah hiding fugitives, meaning the soldiers would come faster, angrier, and with fewer reasons to talk. Jonah wanted to run, to saddle the horse and flee into the open plains, but he knew the truth. Running with a child and an injured warrior would leave tracks clear as ink on white parchment, and soldiers with horses could outrun hope itself. Chaitan saw the fear in Jonah's eyes and said quietly, "They will not stop, but I will not let them take him." Jonah looked at the warrior, at the man who had already lost everyone else he loved, and something fierce sparked inside him, something stronger than fear. A promise. Before he could speak, Nikon crawled into both their laps, clutching their hands with his small ones, whispering, "We stay together." The words, fragile and trembling, filled the room with a warmth that war could not kill, and Jonah realized the boy had chosen them both, chosen this strange, unlikely family formed from broken pieces and desperate hope. Jonah took a shaky breath and told Chaitan he wasn't going to lose the boy. Not to soldiers, not to anyone. And as the lamp flickered low, the ranch outside wrapped in darkness. Jonah and Chaitan understood what the night demanded of them. If the soldiers came, if the sheriff came, if hatred rode in with torch and rifle, they would face it not alone, but as something stronger than chance. A wounded warrior, a gentle rancher, and a child whose survival bound them tighter than blood. And outside, far across the plains, a faint rumble of distant hooves whispered that the storm was already coming. The next 48 hours twisted the ranch into something unrecognizable, a place no longer built for cattle and chores, but for survival. And Jonah moved through each moment with a sharpened awareness that felt foreign in his usually gentle body. Because every sound, every creak of the porch boards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, could have been hooves, shouts, rifles cocking in the dark. Chaitan slept little, pacing the edges of the property like a wounded ghost unwilling to rest, a man whose entire tribe had been carved down to memories and smoke, and Jonah watched him with worry growing in his chest like a second heartbeat, knowing the wound in the warrior's side needed more time than the danger outside would give. Nikan sensed the tension even when no one spoke of it, staying close to both men like a small bird tucked between storms, gripping Jonah's shirt whenever he felt the air shift, and gripping Chaitan's hand whenever the warrior paused mid-step, as if listening to something only he could hear. As the sun sank on the second evening, the sky burned deep orange over the plains, and Jonah felt dread creep up his spine like cold fingers. Because the wind had gone still, the animals restless, and even the cicadas seemed to have swallowed their song. Chaitan stepped up beside Jonah on the porch, face carved from shadow and fading light, and whispered, "They are near." And Jonah didn't doubt it. He felt it too, the same way the land feels a storm before clouds gather. They moved quickly, Jonah locking windows and loading the rifle, Chaitan checking the knife strapped to his thigh, Nikan hiding beneath the floorboards as quietly as a heartbeat, though this time his eyes were wet, and Jonah knelt and cupped the boy's face and said, "No matter what you hear, you stay hidden until I come for you." And the boy nodded with trembling determination. Night fell heavy and slow, draping the ranch in a darkness so deep it swallowed shapes whole, and Jonah and Chaitan took their positions, Jonah near the door, rifle tucked into his shoulder, Chaitan by the back window, breathing shallowly, jaw clenched against pain he refused to acknowledge. Minutes crawled. Then the world cracked open. Hoofbeats exploded from the darkness in a thunderous rush, torches flaring to life like burning stars, voices shouting orders, boots slamming into dirt as a dozen soldiers spread across the ranch yard, their silhouettes tall, rifles gleaming, hatred in their movements. Jonah's blood iced over. A voice he recognized rose above the chaos, the sheriff's rough drawl, shouting for them to come out in the name of the law, though every ounce of Jonah's instinct screamed that what stood outside wasn't law, but vengeance wearing a badge too small to hide its malice. Jonah didn't move, didn't speak. Chaitan crouched low, watching the shadows. The soldiers kicked at the barn door, flipped troughs, smashed lanterns, searching not for justice, but for a child they intended to erase. One torch was thrown at the side of the barn, and dry wood caught with a roar, flames crawling up the planks like hungry insects. Jonah's breath shook, but he didn't step outside, because stepping out meant dying and leaving Nikan alone. The sheriff shouted again, mocking Jonah's silence, telling him the town would sleep easier if the rancher handed over the red-skin brat, and they could all get back to normal. Jonah raised the rifle then, heart pounding so hard he thought it might shatter his ribs, and he whispered to Chaitan, If they break the door, I shoot first." And Chaitin nodded, already lifting his knife. But before the soldiers reached the house, something shifted. The faintest movement at the edge of the torchlight. The soldiers didn't notice, too busy shouting threats and kicking dirt at the porch. But Jonah saw it first. A flicker of motion in the tall grass. Then another, until shapes emerged. Silent, steady, deadly. Lakota riders, a small band of survivors who had followed Chaitin's trail across the plains to repay a debt of blood and family. Their faces were streaked with ash, their bows drawn, their horses restless beneath them as they waited for the final moment between peace and violence. Chaitin saw them next, and something fierce lit in his eyes, a spark of the tribe he thought he'd lost. Before he could signal them, one soldier shouted, spotting movement, lifting his rifle, and the night erupted. Arrows hissed from the darkness, striking soldiers with brutal precision, dropping 3 before the others even understood they were under attack. Gunfire exploded in every direction, bullets snapping past the windows, men screaming as horses bucked and torches fell. The sheriff dove behind a trough, yelling orders drowned by the chaos. Jonah ducked as a bullet shattered the front window, glass exploding like ice, and Chaitin threw himself across the floor to grab the fallen rifle Jonah kept near the hearth. The house shook under the storm of violence. Jonah fired once through the doorway, hitting a soldier rushing the porch. Chaitin fired from the back, protecting the riders who'd risked death to reach them. The Lakota fought like ghosts, appearing, striking, vanishing, while soldiers fired wildly into the darkness. The barn collapsed under its own flames, filling the yard with choking smoke that masked the warriors' movements even further. Jonah's lungs burned, eyes stinging, but he kept shooting until his rifle clicked empty and his hands trembled too much to reload. The world narrowed to fire, shouting, hoofbeats, and the pounding of Jonah's own terrified heart. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise thinned, the soldiers faltering, falling, fleeing into the dark plains, leaving only the sheriff, wounded and crawling for his dropped revolver. Chaitin stepped onto the porch despite his injury, lifting Jonah's empty rifle like a staff and leveling it at the sheriff, voice cold as winter frost. "No more." The sheriff froze, rage and fear warring in his eyes. Jonah climbed out beside Chaitin, chest heaving, and said quietly, "You're done here." And something in his voice made even the sheriff understand that the time for intimidation had passed. The sheriff spat blood, cursed them all as traitors, promised the army would come for them. But he stumbled away into the darkness alone, his threats fading with the sound of retreating boots. When silence finally fell, heavy and disbelieving, Jonah and Chaitin looked at each other through drifting smoke. The Lakota riders gathered around them, battered, but alive. And from beneath the floorboards, Nikon crawled out, eyes filled with terror and hope, running into both men's arms as if they were the only safe place left in the world. Jonah lifted the boy, Chaitin placing a hand on Jonah's shoulder, and in that moment, surrounded by ruin and ash and the remnants of a tribe refusing to die, the 3 of them realized something powerful and terrifying. They were no longer tied together by necessity, but by choice, by loyalty, by a bond the world would not understand or forgive. And as the first pale streaks of dawn crept over the horizon, Jonah looked at the broken ranch, the burned barn, the bodies in the dirt, the tribe standing wounded but unbroken, and understood that their old lives were gone forever, and a new one, dangerous and uncertain, was rising with the sun. The morning after the battle settled over the land like a bruise, purple and raw, the air thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. And Jonah stood in the yard, staring at what was left of the world he had tried so hard to keep ordinary. Shattered boards, burnt beams, arrows buried in dirt, boot prints cutting through the dust like scars that wouldn't fade. And for the first time since Nikon arrived, Jonah felt the weight of everything crashing over him, a heaviness so sharp it made his lungs ache. Because the barn was gone, the cattle scattered, the sheriff had fled but not surrendered, and the soldiers, those soldiers, would be back, angrier, more desperate, carrying orders that turned men into monsters. The Lakota riders who had saved them moved like shadows in the aftermath, tending to their wounded, whispering to their horses, their eyes grim with the knowledge that this fight had not been a victory, only a postponement. Jonah could see exhaustion etched into every line of Chaitin's posture as he leaned against the porch post, one hand pressed against his bandaged side, watching Nikon chase a wounded pony that had somehow wandered into the yard during the chaos. The boy's laughter fragile but real, rising like a small miracle above the ruin. Jonah walked to Chaitin, unsure what words could exist between two men who had nearly died side by side, but Chaitin spoke first, voice low and unsteady. "We cannot stay." The words struck Jonah like a blow, even though he knew they were true. The ranch had lost its innocence the moment soldiers crossed its borders, and now it stood marked on a map inside some officer's tent, branded a threat, a stain to be scrubbed clean. Jonah looked out across the scorched land he had poured years into, land that, despite its stubborn hardness, had been his only claim to belonging, and the thought of leaving it felt like cutting out a piece of his own flesh. "Where would we go?" he asked, his voice fraying. Chaitin glanced at the small band of Lakota survivors, their faces hollow with grief, their movements slow from injury and hunger. "North," he said, "into the Badlands, rough country. The army will not follow quickly. My people, what remains, they will gather there." Jonah nodded slowly, the weight of it settling deep. "And me?" he asked quietly. Chaitin looked at him then, really looked, with an expression Jonah couldn't decipher. Surprise, respect, sorrow, maybe even gratitude. "You saved my nephew. You stood against men who would have killed him," Chaitin said. "You are part of this now, whether you wanted to be or not." Jonah let out a shaky breath. "I don't want the boy growing up running from guns and fire." Chaitin's eyes softened in a way Jonah rarely saw. "Then run only until we can stand." They fell into silence as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the broken ranch. Nikon approached them with the pony in tow, the boy's smile bright despite the dried tear lines on his cheeks. "Horse stays?" he asked hopefully. Jonah ruffled his hair. "If she wants to," he said, and the pony snorted as if answering. But beneath that small brightness, Jonah felt the ground shifting beneath all their feet. Every footprint left in the dust, a reminder that death rode close behind them. As the Lakota began preparing to leave, Jonah walked through the house one last time, touching the worn edges of the table, the small wooden horse Nikon had carved, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, each object a goodbye he wasn't ready to make. He paused at the window, staring at the blackened outline of the barn, and whispered, "I tried," though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the land, his father's memory, or the version of himself he'd been before a warrior asked him to raise a child. Outside, Chaitin tightened his saddle, his face tightening in pain with every movement, yet he refused help, determined not to show weakness in front of his scattered warriors. Jonah lifted Nikan into the saddle before climbing onto the horse behind him, the boy leaning back into him with trust that made Jonah's throat tighten. As the small group began to ride away from the ranch, Jonah looked back one final time and froze. Dust rose on the far horizon, moving fast, too fast for wind. Chaitan saw it too. "Riders," he said sharply. "Bluecoats." Panic slammed into Jonah's chest, but Chaitan barked orders to his warriors, who formed a protective ring around the small group, bows drawn, ready to defend the last pieces of their tribe. Jonah's pulse roared in his ears as he tightened his grip on Nikan, heart splitting between fear and fury, knowing the soldiers would not stop until every survivor was accounted for, dead or detained. Chaitan wheeled his horse beside Jonah's and said through clenched teeth, "When I say ride, you ride. Do not look back." Jonah wanted to argue, wanted to say he wouldn't leave Chaitan to fight alone, but the warrior's eyes held a command carved from the bones of his ancestors. The thunder of hooves grew louder, the soldiers closing fast, rifles glinting in the rising sun. Chaitan raised his arm, wind whipping his braids, and shouted a single word, "Now!" Jonah kicked the horse hard, bursting forward as the Lakota riders opened on either side, unleashing arrows into the approaching soldiers, the crack of rifles splitting the air, the world erupting into chaos once more. Jonah didn't look back. He couldn't. He felt Nikan bury his face against his chest, felt the horse's muscles straining beneath them, felt the familiar land falling away behind them like a dying dream. But as they fled into the vast, unforgiving plains, Jonah knew one truth as fierce as any fire. He was no longer just a rancher trying to survive. He was a father running for a child's future, a man bound to a tribe he never expected to call his own. And whatever storm waited ahead, he would face it with the boy in his arms and the warrior at his side, even if it meant losing everything else he'd ever known.